Welcome back, everybody. And so today we're going to finish up our section on ancient Greece. And the topic is going to be the rise of Macedon. Our focus question is going to be, how was Philip able to assert himself as the master of Greece? Many people had tried, yet Philip was the one who was ultimately successful. The first thing I want to do is I want to look at Macedon. We haven't talked much about Macedon at all. If you look at our map of the ancient Greek world here, Macedon sits right up over here. It's to the north of Greece. Now, it's debated in ancient times, and it's still, believe it or not, a raging debate today for political reasons we won't go into, whether the Macedonians were Greeks. They spoke a dialect of Greek, as I understand it. They could understand the Greeks, but the Greeks couldn't really understand them. Macedon was a bit unique in the Greek world. It was right on its edge, and it was a kingdom. It wasn't a city-state. It wasn't like Athens, a city-state in a surrounding area. It was an actual kingdom. It was expansive in that way. It was quite a bit bigger than a typical city-state. It had quite a bit of mineral wealth and quite a bit of riches, but it was wild. It was kind of considered a wild, hilly country to the Greeks. And having a king and his local aristoi almost harken back to the days of the Homeric Greeks, the Greeks of Homer's time. You know, it was almost like a time capsule of what Greece had been 400 years earlier. It was also quite politically unstable. Even though it had a king, there were a lot of tribes up in the mountains that he had only loose control over. The aristocracy of Macedon was notoriously proud and difficult to control. And it really wasn't on the radar of many Greeks in the course of the 5th century. And it would only slowly appear on the radar as the 4th century progressed, because the Macedonians were just considered backwards, hillbillies, if you will. Well, that was until the time of Philip II of Greece, Philip of Macedon, as he's sometimes called. A little bit about Philip. Philip was the son of the previous king, and for political reasons, he had spent quite a bit of his youth in Greece, in the city of Thebes, which was one of the leading Greek city-states at that time. And while there, he soaked in Greek culture. He observed the way that the Greeks fought each other. He observed the way they squabbled with each other, their political differences, their rivalries. Philip was a very intelligent man, and he observed Greece's weaknesses. He appreciated Greek culture himself. He liked Greece, but maybe he developed a type of infatuation with it. See, as we're going to see soon, he's going to try to conquer Greece. Well, after his stay in Greece was up, he returned back to Macedon to inherit his kingdom, which wasn't probably the greatest thing in his mind, because remember, Macedon is backwards and unstable. But Philip took what he had learned in Greece and he used it to upgrade his own military. He upgraded the Macedonian army and trained them to fight in a phalanx formation. As a matter of fact, he improved upon the Greek phalanx. Rather than using the 6-foot pike that the Greeks typically used. Philip used an 18-foot pike, so nearly 3 times as long. And this proved to be very difficult to fight against. Many contemporaries said the Macedonian phalanx looked like a giant porcupine coming at them. So you can imagine. He also brought Greek engineers with him back to Macedon, and he had them develop and improve upon some of the existing siege technology, like catapults and crossbows and battering rams and various implements that he could use to break down the walls of cities. The Macedonians had always been known for their cavalry, their men on horseback, and this continued to be a important part of Philip's military machine. And he used all of these various components of his army in a very creative way. It should also be mentioned that Philip, being a king, didn't have to deal with many of the troubles that the typical Greek city-state had to deal with. For instance, he was a king. He didn't have to engage in political debates. Class issues weren't really a thing in Macedon because it was the king's word that ultimately prevailed. Of course, he has to take into consideration his nobles, what they think, but really he was the one who was calling the shots. The turmoil that was breaking Greece apart didn't really exist in Macedon. Furthermore, because he had a kingdom, he was able to finance a professional army. In other words, unlike the typical Greek soldier who was a part-timer, the Macedonians had a professional army corps, and this proved to be very useful in coming battles because Philip could keep his army in the field as long as he wanted. Well, Philip began to expand his dominion. The first thing he did was he turned north to the area of Thrace, and Thrace is located right up here. And Thrace was an attractive target because it was even wilder and less organized than Macedon was. And it also had a great amount of mineral resources, namely silver, which Philip knew he could use to further enhance his power and his prestige. And so conquering Thrace was relatively easy for Philip, and the benefits were immense. Philip then began to turn his attention to northern Greece. And he used what he had learned about the Greeks to his advantage, about their weaknesses and their flaws. One thing that Philip knew is that the Greeks were addicted to fighting each other. And he used this to great advantage to himself. What he would do is he would play city-state A off against city-state B, and then conquer it, and play C off against D and conquer it. And so bit by bit, Philip was able to nibble at northern Greece, conquering more and more of it, forming alliances, and getting more and more people under his hegemony. He was also adept at exploiting the internal weaknesses of the various polis. For example, he knew that within the Greek polis, part of the population would be most likely gung-ho and pro-war, usually the poorer members who often, as I mentioned, could get jobs rowing. He knew that these people resented the wealthy and the powerful. He also knew that middle class and wealthy individuals were resentful that they were continually having to pay for these wars. And so Philip was able to appeal to these wealthy individuals, promising them that should Macedon ever be successful, that he would put an end to this ceaseless bloodshed and save them money in the long run. And so he pitched himself as a great supporter of oligarchy, rule by the few. Philip rightly reasoned that democracies are messy, and that it would be much easier to support a few local individuals of high status who would be loyal to him than to try to herd the mob of cats that was the typical Athenian or democracy from other places. Well, as Philip was expanding during the mid-4th century, many of the Greeks were too busy fighting each other to even realize what was happening. When they finally did wake up, it was too late. Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and some of the other Greek city-states eventually formed themselves into a Hellenic alliance. I should mention Sparta was not part of this. Sparta was mad at everybody, and so they didn't take part in this. But when they finally did form this Hellenic League, it was really too late. They weren't facing the Persians, who were coming from 1,000 miles away with lightly armed troops. They were facing an opponent who was already entrenched in Greece. They were facing an opponent who fought like they did, but better, with a professional army, with advanced military capabilities, someone who was brilliant at diplomacy. And so when these Greek city-states faced off against Philip in 338 at the Battle of Chaeronea, and it's spelled like this, Chaeronea, 338 BC, they were unsuccessful, and Philip was able to crush them. Philip that day was commanding the right flank of his cavalry. His young son, 17-year-old son, was commanding the left flank, and that day father and son, like a hammer and anvil, crushed what was left of Greek resistance. Most of the Greek city-states, excluding Sparta, quickly submitted to Philip, and Greek freedom became a thing of the past. Wouldn't be until the 1820s of our own era that the Greeks would eventually become independent again. Well, Philip was now the master of Greece. Now, it would have been completely within Philip's right to crush the Greeks, to kill and enslave, but Philip wasn't about that. He was actually an admirer of Greece, as I mentioned. By the way, the fancy word for that is a Philhellene. Phil meaning to love, and Hellene is Greek. So he really liked all things Greek and wasn't about to destroy it. Philip made good on his promise to the oligarchs, and so he swept away any democracies that were in Greece and put a few loyal local supporters in their place. Now, Philip wasn't necessarily the most popular guy in Greece at this point. Many Greeks rightfully resented the fact that their freedom was being taken away. And so Philip, being a very astute leader, came up with a clever plan to take attention away from himself. What do you do when everybody's looking at you, pointing fingers and hating you? Well, you get someone that they can hate even more and forget about you. And so Philip announced to the Greeks at a meeting in the Greek city-state of Corinth that the reason he had to conquer Greece was because he actually wanted to unite them and bring them on a bigger purpose. And that bigger purpose was to go fight the real enemy, not him, but Persia. And so Philip immediately began to make preparations for his attack on the Empire of Persia. Well, we'll look at the Persians and the Macedonians in future lectures, but what I'd like you to do is I would like you to think about this. How was Philip able to assert himself as the master of Greece?